What's up, everybody? So, today we're going to be talking about this thing that we call life and how to catch up in this race. And no, I'm not talking about the movie with Martin Lawrence and Eddie Murphy. I'm talking about the past, the present, and the future, and what we're living in right now and the things we're starting to see. So, right now, we're living in a time where technology is fusing with every part of our existence. You have your AI, robotics, biotech, quantum computing. It's all happening faster than we can even see. In every industry, we're seeing this in healthcare, education, manufacturing, finance, even in our personal lives, we're seeing this. People, they're creating dolls now for personal entertainment, if you know what I mean, which is a whole different story, And even in our fast food, we're seeing that, they can flip burgers, they can do all these things. It's starting to take over. And, when we're seeing these things take over and take people's jobs, whose jobs are they going to be taking? And then who's gonna be helping the robots? Who's programming these robots? Who's owning the robots is what we're gonna be talking about. Um, so when we look at history, when we see these big changes in the industries, you know, everyone's not brought along with these changes. We often see people like me and you, black and brown people, that's left behind during these changes. When looking back at history, we see that is proof is in the pudding. We see that Black Americans have always been blocked out from participating in past industrial revolutions. And if we're not intentional, history can repeat itself with even greater consequences. So that's why it's a term called Sankofa. It means to go back and get it, symbolizing the importance of learning from the past to inform the future. So going back to the past, whatever that may look like, and using that to how we live in the future. And that's what we need to do if we want to catch up in this race and close this wealth gap and close all the other things that we talk about as a black community. But let's first rewind. Let's talk about this past and let's look at it. So during the first and second industrial revolutions, we see that black Americans were largely excluded from land ownership, skilled trades, and industrial jobs. Then we had your systemic racism, Jim Crow laws, and even deliberate suppression of black wealth accumulation. Um, and so, we see those things throughout history. And later, during the rise of the Silicon Valley and the dot-com era, once again, we see the same pattern. While massive tech wealth is being created, black entrepreneurs and technologists, they faced barriers. They couldn't really access venture capital. They didn't have many networks or education pipelines. And by the time tech became the new oil, black communities have already been largely sidelined. And so the wealth gap widened further, the innovation gap widened further, and the opportunity gap widened further. So today, um, is becoming there's a new revolution that's coming right now, the fourth industrial revolution, and basically, it's what I've talked about earlier. It's the technology, the AI. You know, artificial intelligence is becoming the new literacy. Simple as that. Software is eating the world. So if those without digital literacy, they won't just be behind, but they'll be locked out. They won't be able to access or be able to do what they need to do to stay afloat in a sense. Not even stay afloat, but to get ahead. Robert F. Smith, the richest black man in America, he speaks on this in the conversation, in the podcast with Earn Your Leisure. And he said basically how we're at a point where software programmers are the architects of the future. Every business system, whether it's a hospital, school, or trucking company, is being reimagined through digital solutions. And yet, there's a growth shortage of them, you know. And if black and brown students are not trained now, for the next 8 to 20 years, that window will close. The market will move ahead, so far ahead that catching up will become almost impossible. And his background is in engineering. And he talks about that, on how learning to solve problems systemically position him to enter the world of private equity and was built for had a mindset built for success. How many people see engineering as just math and machines. It really taught them to be structured at problem solving, at a big scale, and how it was a skill that's priceless in any industry. And so Smith, he understood that ownership was crucial, owning the software solutions, owning the platforms, and owning the companies. He didn't get that by luck. It was by intelligence. It was strategy, skills, and access. Things that were denied to people that looked like him, me, and you, um, are not being denied anymore. We have to be able to access these things. But it's hard to access these things because, we have things called broadband deserts, which are broadband is high speed internet. And the deserts part is not available or affordable to us. It's basically become the new segregation lines. So Smith kind of talked about this too as well, about how entire communities are being locked out of online education, online entrepreneurship, remote work, and access to AI tools simply because they can't get online. Just they can't get online. You know, and Joanne Rowe, the dean of school of business at Medgar Evers College, she talked about it and said, if you don't have access to broadband, you're not in the economy of tomorrow. And so she called it a life opportunity gap. And she's right. Because it's not just about Netflix or TikTok, the things you guys spend all the time on. It's about access to the markets, to telehealth, to education, and to career pathways. And so without it, black and brown communities will permanently be locked out of the fourth industrial revolution. And so this is critical. It's critical that we don't repeat this history because we can't afford to be consumers of this revolution. We have to be creators, we have to be owners, and we have to be the architects of the future. Because to echo the great Gil Scott Heron, the revolution will not be televised. It's going to be digitized, coded, and automated. And if we are not coding it, if we are not engineering it, if we are not building it, then we're simply watching it happen without us. We're just watching from the sideline. And so what do we have to do? Well, first we got to educate our communities, which is a big part of it. I'm not talking about just traditional education, but digital literacy. This has to become our next reading. It has to be as important as reading is. We have to have coding boot camps, AI courses, data science certifications. We need to flood these spaces. Second, we got to advocate for broadband equity. Push it at the local, state, and federal levels for universal broadband access. Without it, our dreams are going to die in the dark. Third, we have to create and fund pipelines from HBCUs to community colleges and grassroots organizations into the tech careers. This job is not just a market; it's a wealth market. It's going to create money, and this is where most of the money is going towards the future. And we can see this now. We always talk about we want to be rich or build wealth for our families as a community. So this is where it starts. This is where the trend in society. This is where society is leading us to. So let's jump on it while we can. And fourth, we have to own the tools. We need black-owned tech platforms, black venture capital, black AI labs, black innovation hubs. And finally, we have to tell our young people the truth. They're not just consumers of technology; they're the future inventors, investors, and innovators. We have to pour into them now because waiting will cost us another century. In closing, I'm gonna leave you with this: the fourth industrial revolution is not waiting. The algorithms are already being written, the companies are being built already, and the future is being coded. The only question is, will it be architects or will it be art? Or will we be artifacts? You know. So what's that song Kirk Franklin sings? I say, do you want a revolution? Do you guys want a revolution? Because it's already here. So we got to get started. It has to become second nature. Like we've been talking about all day. So let's learn. Let's do something. Let's get into it. Let's start with the programming. Let's start taking classes. Let's start, whether it's in college, but it has to start young. But wherever you're at now, get a certification, get a college course, whether it's elective or not. Learn something. Learn something on your own. Get on TikTok. Go down those rabbit holes talking about these things. You'll see, because this is one way how we're gonna create generational wealth and close that gap between black and brown versus white people. Because this is where the society is heading. So let's do it.